Hi, I'm Kent. Let's see if we can get a nice smooth mold from a 3D print. As I've been iterating on my mold system, which is getting close to complete, at least for single part molds, a few people have asked about 3D printed artifacts in the molds that I've been making. Since I've been iterating quickly on these molds, I've been basically printing them as fast as my printer will go. My printer's old, so that's actually not that fast, but it does relieve some artifacts in the 3D prints themselves. So here is a finished pot that I made, and if you look closely, you'll notice some artifacts of the 3D print. So there's two different ones in particular. So one, there is this vertical banding, and that is from a setting in actually creating the 3D model. In my software, I've gone ahead and bumped that up, but here it's relatively low. The other one is you can still faintly see 3D printed lines in some of these. Some of these I've cleaned up a little bit, so they're not as present. You can also see in the foot a little bit, next to my stamp here, there's a few lines. This is after firing, so obviously it's shrunk, so any features that were there will have shrunk along the way, and I've also done some processing of this pot along the way. I've sponged off the bottom, I smoothed out some pieces, etc. So here's a bone dry pot. Again, it's got this same ribbing. That's a setting in my software. The 3D printed artifacts you can see again around the foot. It's not quite smooth. I've sponged this one off a little bit. There's also a seam line, and here is the associated model. So that seam line here, you can see some of the artifacts in the foot are right there. As I've been iterating, these haven't been a big deal, but some people are not interested in this look and they actually want something smooth. So how can we get a smooth 3D printed pot? I was fixing a few bugs in my mold system, so I wanted to print out a new mold, and I decided to go ahead and retire one of my old molds. So this here is one of my oldest molds that I created a couple years ago at this point. I actually 3D modeled and printed the mold form for this. If you look way back on my channel, you can see that. And I went ahead and made it smooth, and I used this primer filler, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes. So I went into my software and decided to go ahead and design a new pot. So here's the outside form. I just drew this in 2D, and then the software does everything else. I then went ahead and printed out the rest of these pieces. Again, this is a test print. Some of these could have actually been printed in one piece instead of multiple pieces. Ignore that part for right now. So this is the test for the scale version, and here is the associated form that will create that pot. So it's been scaled up to account for clay shrinkage, and I have my slip well added on, and then these other pieces are the outside. So this is the surface that will get transferred into our pot. It is therefore the one we want to pay attention to and try and make as smooth as possible. I don't know if you can pick it up on camera, but there's some of that banding I was talking about before. It's much reduced here. I basically upped the radial resolution, so it's much tighter. This one I also printed on much finer settings. This one I think I'm printing on 0.3 millimeter layer height, and basically as fast as my printer will go. This one I slowed it down a lot, and I'm printing at 0.15 millimeter layer height. I could potentially go even smaller layer heights, but it really does take a long time if you do that. So there are very few artifacts, I think, compared to this one, but there are still some. So when we have a seam line, there's still a few things around the foot. So how are we going to take care of those? Well, the answer is basically, as I mentioned, primer and sandpaper. Very early on in my career, I was working with some industrial designers, and this was before 3D printers were very affordable. They were like $100,000 machines. And they needed to go and create mock-ups of potential different products. What they did is actually they took foam and cut it out and basically used a lot of Bondo and sanding and this same primer filler to go and create things that actually in the end very much look like plastic. So with enough patience and post-processing, you can go and take any form and go ahead and make it as smooth and as shiny as you want. And since the plaster will pick up a lot of surface details, if you apply that same attention to something that's 3D printed, the plaster mold will just get that much better. The trade-off is, of course, now we're putting more effort into post-processing the pot. I am a fan of basically taking this off the printer and running with it, but if you want a really high-quality surface finish, you can do some of these things. So as I mentioned, one is basically slow down the print and reduce the layer height. You can also put in smaller nozzles. There's a whole bunch of 3D printing channels out there, and they could talk a lot about different settings you can do to go ahead and get increased print quality. You can also switch technologies altogether. So this is FDM, so it's taking small filament and squeezing it out of a nozzle, kind of like a hot glue gun, and the 3D printer is basically moving around that nozzle in various ways to lay down thin bits of plastic. The other big technology is SLA printers. Basically, these are using a UV curable resin. that will get hard when it gets exposed to UV light, and then they basically use an LCD screen to expose one layer at a time. So the areas that they want to be empty, they leave black, and the areas they want to turn into plastic, they make clear, shine a UV light through it, and that creates one layer. They then step the level up just a tiny bit and do that over and over again. So the horizontal resolution is limited by the LCD screen, and the vertical resolution is limited by the stepper motor. So in short, you can play a lot with the 3D printing settings themselves just to get a better finish. Well, what if that still isn't good enough? Well, that's where the sanding comes into place. So to start with, I'm going to just basically take a sanding block and knock down any obviously high areas. I'm only going to really focus on the surface of the pot here. The rest of it, where the slip well is, I'm not really worried about. There's a few nubs here from the 3D print. I might need some different sandpaper to deal with this. And then the other big one is the seam right here. I don't know if you can see the shadow of that. And I can feel it, and you can see it in the pot. So I'm just going to try and knock some of it down right now. All right, so that's the first pass. So we've basically taken down some of the high areas. The problem is the 3D print has a bunch of valleys as well, and that's where the primer comes in. So we're going to lay down this primer that goes on extra thick to basically start to fill in some of those valleys. We can then go around with the sandpaper again and take off the high areas. And we'll do that several times. So let me go ahead and dry this off, and then off camera, I'll go ahead and put a coat of this on. Okay, I just went ahead and put a few coats on. So reading the instructions, you can basically put a coat on after about 10 minutes and recoat it as soon as it's dry. So I just did 3 coats. So here's what it looks like. I can still feel some raised surfaces. So basically what we'll wind up doing is once this dries, we'll sand through the high spots to get down to the low spots, and we might do this a couple of times. So it says that this needs to cure for 2 to 4 hours before sanding, so I'm going to go ahead and let that happen. It's also starting to get warm here in my garage, so we'll go ahead and take a break and come back and give this a little sanding, and then we'll see where we stand. The primer has dried. You can still see some of the artifacts that are in the 3D print there. And there's the line from before. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and sand this. Got my wet dry sandpaper out. All right, watching sanding is about as fun as watching paint dry, and unfortunately we're doing both in this video. So there is one pass, and it's starting to smooth out a little bit. You can see some of the layer lines, for instance, that are starting to show through. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry the rest of the way out. Since I just wet sanded it, then go ahead and put another coat on and do it again. All right, the second coat is on and dry. It's definitely looking more smooth. I can see a bit of an artifact here where the seam line was. I'll give this another quick sand. All right, there's one more time around sanding. I think we're rapidly hitting diminishing returns. You can still see some visual artifacts, but if I feel it, it feels very smooth. Potentially we could do one more coat and another round of sanding, but I'm not too sure it would help that much. You can still see the texture here in the slip well, which I haven't been sanding, versus the texture on the pot. Potentially you could work your way up through the sanding grits and get this even more smooth, but I think I'm going to go ahead and run with this. We'll assemble the mold pieces, and then we'll go ahead and pour plaster. The mold is all dry, and I've got it partially assembled. I've got the outside ring together as well, so all the threaded inserts and the gasket material. Next up, I'll go ahead and screw this together and pour the plaster in. And I went ahead and measured out the volumes that the software put out, the amount of water and the amount of dry plaster. So let me go ahead and mix up the plaster and finish assembling the mold, and then we can go ahead and pour it. All right, we'll go ahead and pour the plaster. All right, the plaster's cured. Let's go ahead and pull it out. All right, there's the top ring. All right, there we go. There's the outer mold. This funky shape here is because the software automatically creates this contour to follow the pot. I guess this is stuck. So we'll go ahead and put the ice and alcohol in. There we go. And there is our mold. And you can see some of the paint coming off. You can look and see how smooth that is. So definitely the priming and sanding works. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry out, and then we will slip cast a pot and we can check out the surface finish then. And here is our mold. It's a little bit wet from the ice and alcohol mixture, but it's also looking in very good shape still. So I suspect we could go and reuse this and make another plaster mold if we wanted. Back in a sec for you guys, and you can see the dry mold. All dry now. Let's go ahead and slip cast a couple of pots. I think while I'm at it, I'm gonna slip cast this bowl that I showed at the beginning as well. That way we can have a nice comparison between the different surface preparations. Let's pour my slip in, up into the slip well. Not that it's relevant for this particular test, but one of the tweaks I did recently is I made the top here of the slip well a little bit thinner. This one here is a little bit thicker than I needed to be, I think. I'm gonna let this sit for half an hour. That's usually what I use for my molds. If I want the pot thicker or thinner, I can dial that in later. Looks like our pots are forming, so let's go ahead and dump out the excess slip. All right, there we go. So far, so good. I'm gonna let this drain some more and let the pot continue to dry a little bit, and then we will pull it out of the mold. This should be good to go ahead and pull out. So let me turn the top first. I just use the slip well as a guide. Go ahead and reclaim that. Grab a wear board. All right, there's our pot. It looks nice and smooth. Definitely still wet, so I'll let this firm up a little bit. And we can do the other one. This is our control. So there we go, side by side. I think you can probably see the layer lines here and the seam, and that looks gone on this pot here. So the pots are starting to dry out, looking nice and smooth. This curve here is smooth, the foot looks well formed. I don't see any problems. And the other one's looking good too. And so for comparison, here's the bowl where you can see some of these lines in it. So these are dry enough to clean up. For these two, I'm just going to go ahead and deal with the rim and leave them alone otherwise. I'm not going to touch the surface. For these two, one of them, I'm going to go ahead and sponge it down a little bit, see if I can get some of the 3D printed lines a little bit better. The other one, I'm going to basically leave as is. I'll do the rim and that's all. Let's take a sponge here. And just rake this edge a little bit. There we go, just like that. All right, this one I'm gonna go ahead and sponge the outside. All right, just like that, just a little bit of sponging. As I mentioned, I'll put these into my next firing after they're dry. I'm gonna go ahead and do a glaze firing with these unglazed. That way we can see what the raw clay looks like. I had a successful glaze firing, and here are the pots. So again, this is just my raw clay that's been fired, no glaze at all. So we can see all of the details in the surface finish. You may not be able to tell from camera, but they are actually very smooth. And I don't see any artifacts of the 3D print at all showing up. So here's a close-up. Again, nice and smooth. The foot here is well defined. And I don't see any of the 3D print artifacts, just the nice crisp shape that I drew up. And not surprisingly, the other one is basically the same. So I don't see any banding here at all. So that's great. That means that the primer worked. So we took the 3D print and was able to smooth it out. And here's the scaled model I used to do a test with to make sure that it was the shape I wanted, and we did a really good job copying it. My clay shrinkage factor looks like it's basically spot on. So that's great. This print is actually much more rough than the final pot. However, I fired more than just these two. We have our controls as well. So these are the bowls that I fired. So first up, the one that I just sponged off the rim a little bit. I think the biggest artifact is you can see the seam line. So up close there's the seam line, and there's a few layer lines down towards the bottom. And then finally, there's a few layer lines in the foot well as well. So I think they are more muted now they've been fired, but they're definitely still present. Here's the pot that I went ahead and sponged off briefly. I didn't spend very long on this, and there's actually a pretty remarkable difference. So if we look at them side by side, there's definitely banding in the original pot. There's a little bit in the one I sponged off, but I suspect if I didn't point it out or you didn't know it was there, you may not see it. The seam line has completely disappeared. And then the foot is also cleaned up. There aren't those layer lines on the inside. I got those with the sponge. There's still a few artifacts here from the 3D print, the layer lines here. I suspect another minute or two sponging and that would also go away. So we have some options if you want a smoother print. Definitely to get the best surface finish, you can go ahead and use the primer like I've showed. These are all nice and smooth. However, sponging actually is very effective. This one isn't quite as silky smooth. It's got a little bit more texture to it. But if this was glazed, you probably wouldn't know the difference at all. You'd also probably go over this with a little bit of high grit sandpaper and smooth it out a little bit more. It may not be quite the same surface finish, but it's actually surprisingly good. For raw clay applications, doing the primer may make a big difference. For glazing, I suspect it would more or less disappear. There you have it, several different options. The primer is definitely very effective, but it requires a lot more manual processing. The 3D print with the sponge is also effective, but you'd then have to sponge down each pot. So you can have that trade-off and decide which one you like. And there may be a middle ground with a higher resolution 3D print that may be somewhere between these two. But that's the great thing about 3D printing these molds, is that we can go ahead and play with the 3D printing variables and go ahead and make the plaster molds and try out the resulting pots and see what we like. Depending upon what you want with your own pots, you can get one of these effects or the other relatively straightforwardly. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.